And now we come to the end of the war and how the peace agreement plays out at the end of World War I. So we see the President of the United States here, Woodrow Wilson, pictured on the first slide. In the months leading up to the eventual unconditional surrender of the Central Powers, nobody worked harder than President Wilson did to try to come to some sort of workable peace agreement that would, in essence, the idea was create a global environment where this can never happen again. A world war that spreads all over the whole world, right? And so he comes up with a plan that becomes known as his 14 points. You want to take a guess how many things he had listed on his 14 points? You got it. There were 14 things that President Wilson came up with that he hoped he could get all of the major nations of the world and all those involved in this war to agree on. The months trying to get this passed by all these different nations took President Wilson back and forth to Europe several times. He worked tirelessly, meeting with different world leaders to try to come up with a way to make this work for everybody. And in the end, the 14 points that he originally proposed is not necessarily the exact 14 points that are passed in the end, because some countries wanted this point but didn't like this point. Other countries said, well, this will work, but we shouldn't have this. Or then some of the things that he listed were things that they just thought should be changed or tweaked a little bit. So in the end, we're going to look at 4 of the 14 points that were eventually agreed upon by all the nations. Well, all the nations except for one, who, because of the idea of unconditional surrender, is not going to have any seat at the table trying to come up with this agreement. That's going to be Germany. So, essentially, all the other major nations in the world, when they're debating and arguing and eventually passing this peace agreement, are basically planning the fate of Germany without Germany having any input. So, all right, here are the 4 things that I want you to know about the peace agreement. Number 1, and this will make sense to all of us because we talked about the impact that this had on the beginning of the war, he proposed that we have an end to secret alliances. We can't have these nations getting into these alliances and making these secret agreements with one another that in the end kind of come out whenever a conflict begins and then everybody's at war with each other. So that was one thing that they agreed upon. 2, he proposed that we must maintain as a globe at this point now freedom of the seas. Basically, they were targeting the idea of that unrestricted submarine warfare, the rules of naval combat, the idea that merchant ships and cruise liners and innocent civilians cannot be wrapped. They should have the freedom and the ability to travel on the global water. So that was something that they agreed on. Number 3, he proposed the idea of self-determination for all nations. Now this goes back to the whole nationalism thing at the beginning of the war. The fact that the Serbians that were living in the part of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo where the assassination occurred, the fact that those Serbians didn't want to live under the rule of Austria-Hungary and instead wanted to be united with their fellow Serbians in Serbia kind of prompted this idea of, well, why don't we let all nations of people determine for themselves how they will be governed and let them have their own countries. Remember, we talked the difference between a nation and a country. This is one of the points that does not get into the 14 points. This was one of the things that it just proved to be too difficult. And part of the reason is when you start talking about all nations, remember, a nation is a group of people that share certain things in common. There were so many different small cultural groups just in the middle of Europe alone, let alone in places like Asia and in Africa. That was just never going to happen that way. That we would have had thousands of little tiny countries all over the world. So he fought for this. He thought this was something that could, help in the future, settling conflicts and things, but that's not going to work out. And then number 4, President Wilson proposed we create an international peacekeeping body. In the end, it's going to be called the League of Nations. Today, we have another international peacekeeping body. The League of Nations disappears after World War II, and a new one is created. Does anybody know what we call it today? I'll let you look that one up. It's called the United Nations. We call it the UN. It kind of was born out of what was created after World War I, the League of Nations, which always just sounded cool to me, like it's some sort of like Marvel comic book thing, the League of Nations, right? Where all these superheroes would, be a part of this group. Anyway, most of the powerful nations in the world agree that's a good idea. That way, when a conflict begins somewhere between two nations, the League of Nations, this whole body from representatives from all over the globe, can come together and try to figure out peaceful solutions to these conflicts without having world wars break out again. All right, so Woodrow Wilson, like I said, travels back and forth to Europe several times, and in the end, meets with all the leaders of the nations getting involved at a meeting in Paris. He presents this plan. He has to compromise on a lot of the things, like I suggested, or like I alluded to earlier. Some nations wanted this, some nations wanted that, whatever. We know that it's going to be too difficult for self-determination of all nations, but we do see the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We do see the breakup of the German Empire in some parts. We see the formation of a couple new countries that didn't exist before the war, countries like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. So the map does change in Europe after the war's over. And the map that would have been before the war is different after the war. But the map that existed after World War I, it was different after World War II. In fact, if you look at it today and you look at all these different time periods, the map has changed over time. So that was one of the things where we did see some new nations being created. And then the last thing that I have here is a point that I did not list on those four on the last slide, but it's one that most of the Allies agreed on, but especially France. France was not going to waver on this last bullet point here. France wanted a part of the treaty to specifically designate Germany as the country at fault for this war. Not only did France want Germany to be held officially responsible for starting this conflict, they also demanded that they get reparations paid to them from the Germans for all of the destruction and all of the things that happened on the Western Front in particular, but really to just the country of France in general. And that number ends up being $33 billion. So part of the treaty, and remember the Germans have no say in this, part of the treaty says that Germany has to pay $33 billion to France. We call that, guess we're gonna have announcements.
Attention students and teachers, we will be administering the Keystone exams in various classrooms in the cafeteria today. There will be no announcements today. Please keep hallway traffic to a minimum and quiet. Students who are taking an exam should report to the cafeteria or their testing room by the start of the day, which is in less than a minute. Teachers are reminded, please do not submit your Keystone testing students on your attendance. Thank you. Have a great weekend.
All right, there you got a little taste of the announcements for today. So we call the term we use for payments by the loser to the winner, we call that reparations. So that's what that term means. That is something that will come up again next year in US 2 when you talk about the beginnings of World War II. The Germans do start to pay this $33 billion back to France after the war because it's part of the treaty. But eventually they will stop making those payments and it'll cause more tension later. So you'll learn more about that later. Okay. So let's wrap this whole thing up. In the end, the peace agreement that is signed is called the Treaty of Versailles. It is signed in Paris at Versailles, and it happens on June 28th, 1919, and it officially ends the war. Now, all of the nations involved signed the Treaty of Versailles, except for one. Anybody want to take a guess what country refused to sign this Treaty of Versailles? It was the United States, that's right. After all the work that President Wilson did to get these countries to agree on the 14 points and then eventually to formalize a treaty and everybody signed it, his own country, when he brought it back here, Congress refused to sign it. And there was a reason. There was one part of the treaty that Congress did not agree with and did not want to be a part of. and that was that League of Nations, that international peacekeeping body. And the logic of our Congress at the time was not that they didn't, it wasn't so much that they didn't want to have some apparatus that could maybe, prevent another world war from happening. What they viewed it as was an apparatus that was just creating more possibilities for a world war. Why? If we don't want alliances, why should we create one giant alliance where everybody has to come together? That means that when a conflict occurs between two nations that maybe the United States would never have any connection to, if we're a part of this organization, we're going to be connected to the conflict. So in the end, Congress refuses to sign the Treaty of Versailles, and by 1921, President Wilson passes away. He ends up getting very sick through all of this, and he ends up passing away. And Warren G. Harding is the new president, and he is the president that actually signs the treaty that gets the United States out of the war. In fact, the United States signed separate treaties with all of the nations that we were involved with, including Germany. So, there you go. Kind of sad end to Woodrow Wilson fighting for this 14 points and making this happen, that his own country did not sign the treaty. And with that, we end World War I, and we get ourselves to a spot where we can be ready to begin US 2 next year. All right?